Come on in for part two. The air is fine. This is a continuing conversation with myself and Dr. Brown. And though we have one episode to go off of, the precedent that I've set with one episode is that we start out talking about how we're doing. We then do a little brief touch on global north, global south. We get to our main story. We end with good news. I feel like this conversation does all of that. So I'm foregoing the formal segment by segment by segment and just having a conversation that touches on everything. And part one just gave a good introduction as to who you are and why you have been chosen for this conversation and why you thought it was worth your time to participate because, could have said no. And now we're getting a little bit deeper into what's been happening in both countries, the countries being Venezuela and Cuba, and kind of why they are so overlapped. But I did want to just point out something that we talked about in part one, which was the fact that, and I think we kind of just said it because we know that Venezuela's only had one census since the colonial period. And like I just want to give that some weight. Like one census since the colonial period in 2011, which was
I should
15
be
years.
clear, that counts the population by race.
Yes, that counts by race. So there's only been one. That's kind of the race since the colonial period, and there hasn't been another one. There's been efforts for there to be another one, but there hasn't been another one. So whatever data they have and had is 15 years old. And we always think about how old stuff is, just in general. It's like, okay, that. And then I was just thinking to myself, we talk about why there are so many Germans in Argentina. And whenever I see a blue-eyed blonde or brown hair white girl talk about her German grandfather, I'm like, does he have a uniform? Like,
Well,
does he
this
have?
is why I also think it's important. Like in the US, we have these conversations, and people will say, "Oh, she's not white. She's Argentinian. Oh, she's not white. She's Costa Rican." And it infuriates me because I need people to understand that whiteness, blackness, indigeneity, mixedness exists uniformly across the entire Americas. It is not just the US.
No, it is not. And speaking of the US, um, we have somebody's president here. Nicolas Maduro, the
Mhm.
president of Venezuela, is here, and he has been here for going on 4 months. I think that's crazy. I know it's crazy because we live where we live. It's not something that gets talked about in the news as much as it should. Kind of how we just glossed over, oh, the one census counting by race since the colonial period. We just said it. It's like, I don't really think people understand. We have another country's president here. And there seems to be no plan to either speed up the trial because he's already been arraigned. He's in New York right now. There isn't anything to actually let there be a trial. It doesn't seem like there's any plan to just send him back. He's just here and he's here.
He originally had a court date for, I think it was March 17th was the first one that was set for, but the US government is refusing to allow him to pay for his own legal
Right.
defense.
And so it's like, what do you really want? So while we can kind of sit here and be like, right, he's just sitting here, it's not as though life in Venezuela is put on pause, right?
Mhm.
So, or Cuba for that matter. So I guess
Mhm.
just the easiest way to just ease into this is what has the capture of Nicolas Maduro done to not only Venezuela but Cuba as well?
Oh, so you want to start depressing me today? No, I'm just- so the one thing I do want to say, just by way of backing up. So one of the reasons why it's speculated, and why I believe too, that Maduro was kidnapped explicitly rather than say killed or deposed in some other way, has a lot to do with the fact that in 2002 there was a similar attempt to oust Chavez, right? And so there was an attempt. It was a temporarily success. I can't talk. Temporarily successful coup d'état that lasted 3 days in 2002, when Hugo Chavez was temporarily overthrown, um, largely U.S. backed. efforts, and that the people and he was still, but he was still in the country. He was preparing to leave the country, but he was still in the country, and the people largely demanded that he come back into power. To be clear, Maduro is nowhere near as popular or as supported as Chavez was. That is a reality. There are, Maduro is not a perfect president. He hasn't performed socialism perfectly. There have been critiques internally, both from the right and even the kind of, I wouldn't call it a fractured left in Venezuela, but
Hmm.
there are different parts of the left of Venezuela who have different takes on what should have been done differently. And so I do want to just acknowledge that Maduro doesn't enjoy the same popularity that Chavez did. However, there is still large support for the vision of the Bolivarian revolution. And and for many people, as Chavez's chosen successor, Maduro represents that, even in his errors and efforts, right? Even in his errors. Um, but in terms of what it what it means for Venezuela, I mean, oh, so this is interesting to answer, right? Because it on the one hand, the biggest threat that Venezuela and Cuba pose to the US is really ideological. And when I say it's ideological, I mean that Chavez had a vision for what he called 21st century socialism. We know that Cuba came to power and implemented the Cuban Revolution was, a communist revolution. Um, Cuba doesn't hold the same kind of economic power, weight. I wouldn't say power, but weight that Venezuela does, because it doesn't have
Hmm.
a natural resource that is being that the US would like to extract, like oil or gas or whatever else. But Cuba has always been a threat because the fact that a country that purports to be communist continues to exist in the US backyard and exists as a foil, or an alternative economic system to the US, is politically and ideologically threatening to the US. Venezuela and Cuba, particularly when Chavez came to power, were long allies, right? And I've pointed this out too. One of the things that I think that was different in the Bolivarian Revolution than was in the Cuban Revolution was actually how early on the question of race was taken up by the Bolivarian Revolution, which in the Cuban case, they kind of tried to deal with it in the typical kind of Latin American fashion, right? If we implement communism, the material conditions of everybody's lives becomes better, and so the Cuban Revolution benefits Afro-Cubans, which it absolutely did. The issue is that anti-blackness or racism, just like, what do you call it, patriarchy, homophobia, misogyny, all these things, they have, while they are intertwined, they have their own lives. And so to not actually tackle those issues politically, intellectually, economically, means that, like in the case of Cuba, when the special period was implemented, all of those anti-black feelings kind of began to not just feelings, but sentiments began to resurface as the society began to become re-stratified economically, right? And so the reason why I say this is interesting is because, on the one hand, one of the reasons why Cuba and Venezuela both suffer is because of the economic sanctions, right? Because of the
Hmm.
blockades that have been imposed upon them by the US government. We know specifically that the economic blockade, or the embargo that has been placed on Cuba, is specifically about punishing them and trying to break the will of the people in their commitment to communism. Similar in the Venezuelan case, with the exception of the fact that the U.S. also wants access to Venezuela's oil reserves. So on the one hand, as Delcy Rodriguez is now in power, one of the first things that occurred was one of the ways in which Venezuela conducted political diplomacy was through their oil program. So they had this program called Petrocaribe that gave like microloans to many Latin American countries. Obviously, people don't like to talk about Cuba and the Dominican Republic as Caribbean, but they are, right. But Haiti as well. And so when Petrocaribe existed, this was a way of creating like a oil. It was like an oil diplomacy program. One of the first things that occurred when they kidnapped Maduro, and then Delcy Rodriguez sort of stepped up to be interim president, is that they cut Venezuela's supply of oil to Cuba. Venezuela's supply of oil to Cuba, we know Cuba already exists under extremely harsh economic blockade conditions. And so as a result of that, Cuba has already been suffering for quite a while because they've been under blockade, economic blockade since the 60s. Um, and their inability to import oil from Venezuela. And because of the way the blockade works, they're not able to import it from anyone else because the US would sanction anyone else who does that. It has literally meant a life or death situation in the Cuban case. When I say that, I mean they literally don't have oil like they don't have fuel to power the country, right? They don't have the power in many instances to keep some hospitals going, to keep refrigeration going, like all of these things. In the Venezuela context, it's interesting because the way that it is getting promoted now is that, oh, now that Maduro's out of the way, now that Delcy Rodriguez is a willing, um, I want to be careful too about this too, because everything that I've read and talked to people about, people want to make clear that they do not feel like this was an internal coup.
Hmm.
The people still trust that Delcy Rodriguez is representing the Bolivarian Revolution, is doing what she thinks is best for her people. And so I both don't want to portray her like a US puppet, but I also want to be clear that many of the things that she is being strong-armed into doing is looking like puppeteering. And I'm not saying that on her part, but literally they're attempting to make arguments now that, oh, now that Venezuela is open to these new economic deals with the US, now what's gonna happen is that whereas the oil reserves were nominally nationalized before and used to support social programs, they are being reprivatized, right? And so, for capitalist, entities, the reprivatization means, oh, there's going to be new economic opportunities and ventures in the country. But privatization of the oil industry also means the stripping of social welfare programs in the country. Things like the missions programs, right? So they had Mission Robinson, which was a literacy campaign. Um, that again learned from the Cuban Revolution and largely and raised literacy rates extremely high during the early years of the Bolivarian Revolution. Other programs like Misión Madres del Barrio, which was like a community organizing program for women of communities. There's many different missions in the country that were supported by the nationalization of the oil resources. The cooperative program, the communes, was largely supported by the revenue that's generated from the nationalization of oil. And so what is materially going to happen is that all of the hallmarks of the Bolivarian Revolution and the socialist nature of the Bolivarian Revolution are going to slowly disappear and slowly dissipate. And I think that it both has a material impact on people in Venezuela, but it also, I think, has an ideological impact on the kind of our understanding of the global left struggle, right? Our ability to struggle against capitalism. And
Hmm.
I think that it has been important that places like Venezuela and Cuba have been a stronghold that make people think, okay, capitalism is not the only option. And so a part of what is happening is that they are trying to make it clear that it is, in fact, the only option, right? And this is why, I know interview isn't about this, but this is why what's happening in Iran is also so important right now, right? Because Iran's ability to push back on the US, incursion, this imperial and colonial incursion into West Asia it might be with the fall of Venezuela, with the continuing decline of Cuba, might be one of our last strongholds against the sort of Western imperial order, right? So that's something, I think there's a lot to say about that, but I think that's kind of the most basic answer to that question.
Now, for the uninitiated, and I'm going to say it one more again. See, Dr. Brown, you don't know, but I've been telling them they gotta go watch episode 0. Okay, because that tell them everything they need to know. We don't say West over here, we say global North. We don't say East over here. We don't do this whole East West thing. It's global North, it's global South.
Mhm.
And we also don't do Middle East because
Mhm.
Middle East is Middle East of what?
Mhm.
Europe, United States. So when we say West Asia, shift in your colonial, indoctrinated minds, which we're not critiquing you, that's just an
Mhm.
observation.
Mhm.
the colonial mind is something that we all have to shed at our own pace and time. But instead of Middle East, we say West Asia. So that's what we're talking about when we say um, West Asia.
Hmm.
I also just want to highlight the fact that for as much of a sense of deja vu we get as Americans with a president like Donald Trump and the immediate knee-jerk reactions to immediately go back to a Reagan period or a Nixon period. And I think also what gets hidden in that is a Bush 2 period. The deja vu isn't just unique to America, it's unique, it's just part of what happens because of this global world order. And so I can't speak on what's been going through the minds of Venezuelans, but I would imagine that much like we can go, we've seen this before. Anyone who was alive for the capture and the forced exodus and the temporarily successful coup of Chavez definitely has to say to themselves, seen this before. We know how this goes. This is nothing new. And I think part of what allows someone to know this isn't new, that they've seen it before, is that they know they can overcome it. And so you and I, we don't treat this like the Olympics where you support your home country. We support the movement. And it's really easy for us to see how this will play out in the sense that no one's going to be eradicated. We won't live in a world without Venezuelans. No matter how many times Donald Trump says that we won't live in a world without Iranians, we won't live in a world without Cubans. That will never happen because the spirit of the people won't let
Hmm.
it happen. And if it is that all it takes is strong arming and bullying, Cuba would have fell 60 years ago
Hmm.
with the Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuba, it would have happened already. And I think people would benefit on studying up on Chavez because really that's just one president ago. Like it's just one president before Maduro.
Hmm.
And the best way I can equate it for people of my generation would be if you took Zoran Mondani and AOC and then Barack Obama. Like if you put all those people together, you still will fall short.
Hmm.
You still will fall. The best way I can put it, it's like he's Jesus Christ superstar. Like it was
Hmm.
Elvis, Michael Jackson, all of the rush of the, and probably like JFK, like the rush of all
Hmm.
of that. And it's,
Oh, Michael Jackson is actually a good comparison. The way
yeah,
people felt about Chavez.
like it's crazy. And I think it's one of those things when you try to think about what American politics tries to do is put the love on someone to the next person. Maduro got all of that because Maduro was Chavez's most recent vice president. And to that point about not looking like a puppet, the interim president, I will say it was interesting that framing of, well, the literal and figurative framing with the Nobel Peace Prize whole thing.
Hmm.
And it was one of those things where they were really making it seem like Donald Trump had made some headway. He's talked about how he's going to run the country. And because our news media is just propaganda, they fed into that whole thing. And thing you and I we've talked about offline is, well, what else are they supposed to do? Like,
Hmm.
what else are they supposed to do? Because it's not like, and I can't remember if this is something we were talking about before I started recording this or not, but just the fact that he's here. Like they're not speeding up the trial, they're not having a trial, they're not letting him pay for anything, they're not giving a date to send him back, they're not saying how long he's gonna stay here. So when you have all that ambiguity, what are you supposed to do?
But they're trying to get everything passed they can before even the possibility of him returning.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't really have a feeling he's gonna languish and die here in the US.
Oh no.
I really don't think that's what's gonna happen. But I do think they are trying, the US government is trying to figure out every political and economic angle before they even begin to entertain the idea of letting him go back.
Now here's what's interesting. Much like the Iranian case, which we won't spend too much time on, or really any, because Lord knows there's a lot going on. The response of the diaspora, i.e., those not in the country and the continent,
Hmm.
so vastly uh,
Hmm.
contradicts the response, the emotional feeling of those who are still on the country. Why
Hmm.
is it that
Hmm.
descendants of Venezuelans and Cubans have such a stark view of Maduro's capture compared to those who are still residing on Cuba and Venezuelan ground?
So this is I'm going to answer this in a broad sense and I'm going to answer it directly. We have to think about all of the immigrant populations in the US. The US has had this dominant hegemonic position in the globe in the world for some time now. And it has been a place where people have wanted to come. And so the US largely attempts to control who comes and who does not. And for the most part, whether those immigrants are Korean, Vietnamese, Filipino, Haitian, Cuban, Venezuelan, the populations that have been allowed to exist in mass here as immigrant populations who've had, special provisions made so that they could enter into the country largely performed some sort of task that supported US imperial interests elsewhere, which is largely why they either had to or wanted to leave their home countries. And so I want to be clear. I'm not saying that every single immigrant
You're right.
is, a traitor to progressive causes in the world. But what I am saying is that where there have been massive waves of immigration from specific places, we have to think about and question why did the US allow that? And what we know about the US is that it has never been because of benevolence. It has never been out of the sheer, goodness of people in power's heart in the US government that they allowed waves of immigrants from any one place to come here at any given time. So I want to say that first. So then I'll say specifically about Cubans and Venezuelans, um, is that the Cubans and Venezuelans, and that's again, to be clear, there are Cubans and Venezuelans who live in this country who
Yes.
actually who are pro, the Cuban Revolution, who were pro the Bolivarian Revolution. There are Afro-Cubans and Afro-Venezuelans in this country who are not antagonistic to those things. But the vast majority of those who came here and particularly were given tax incentives and other kinds of things were able to make a way and make a life are people that were either supporting U.S. intervention or opposed to that particular regime change when the Cuban Revolution came along or when the Bolivarian Revolution came along. And tying back to our previous conversation, because we know that whiteness categorically is about domination and imperial expansion, it has been largely the case that Afro-Cubans and Afro-Venezuelans have either not wanted to or not had the opportunity to immigrate to the US. And that the vast majority of immigrants, Cuban and Venezuelan, who have been able to come to the US have been wealthy and white. And so it is Marco Rubio's family, prime example, right? Um, even the fake excuse me for cursing, but even I don't know, we didn't talk about this, but Juan Guaido, who was a previous what was that, 2017, 2018, was a previous coup attempt by the US government. They tried to impose Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela at this particular time, and Juan Guaido has spent more than half of his life here in the US, right? And so the Venezuelan and Cuban populations in the US are largely pro-American, anti-socialism, and in fact, one of the first messages that I got complaining about my interview that I did with Rooted about Venezuela was a Venezuelan woman who had said that her family, she basically said she was white and indigenous, who said that her family had to leave Venezuela because they had to give up their resources. And this is nothing sorry, I know I'm jumping all over the place, but one of the things that the Cuban Revolution did and the Bolivarian Revolution attempted to do also, like Cuba pre-revolution was a gangster's paradise. It was a place where people went to gamble, prostitution, people had a lot of money, people owned multiple properties. One of the things that the Cuban Revolution said is that you cannot own multiple properties that you do not inhabit. And so many people's properties were reclaimed by the state so that people would have places to live. And so when people say things like my family's property was confiscated from them by the government, people need to do a little bit more research into what that means. The government did not take from people the house that they were living in and occupying. They did reclaim houses that were vacation houses, houses that were not being occupied like more than half of the time, just rent, just what would you call it? Investment properties, right? And so because there was an attempt to say we need to prioritize living people and their ability to like live dignified lives. And to do this, it does not make sense for us to have people who own 8 homes to make money off them while there are other people who are homeless when we literally have the material capacity to provide people homes, right? So
Mhm.
when Venezuelans and Cubans say things like they took our family's property from us, interrogate that more is what I would say. Like interrogate what properties did they take? Did the government didn't make you homeless? The government attempted to create an opportunity for equalization, right? And so, to answer that question about why it is that we have so many people in the US who are anti the current regimes, it is because they came here precisely because from the beginning of those projects, right, in 1959 in the Cuban case, in 1997, 98 in the Bolivarian case, they were already not interested in the direction that those political projects were going. And that is why they sought out asylum in the US. That's why they sought to be immigrants here because they were already politically unaligned. And so I'm often utterly uninterested in what US Venezuelans and Cubans have to say about what's happening on the ground in Venezuela and Cuba, because I know where their interests lie and where their political preoccupations lie.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop for right now for part two, which means we will have a part three, will be our third and final part. And to the best of our ability, we're going to try and answer the broad question of what happens next. That's a question that we've toggled with back and forth offline, and now live time, we're going to do our best to try and answer that before this viewing public. So join us for part three as we try and figure out where we go from here.